and welcome to Classical Schmassical, the anti-classical classical music podcast. Tune in every Saturday or thereabouts as we discuss, deconstruct, and dissect what it means to be a musician in the modern world. I'm your host, Alexa Letourneau. I use any pronouns, and our guest this week is James Creed.
Hello, I'm James Creed. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a composer. I make scores, kind of semi-experimental text things, and I play the guitar sometimes.
Amazing. I'm just about to write my first guitar piece ever, and it's scary to me, but I'm excited to explore the depths of what a guitar can do.
It's a strange instrument.
Yes. I'm so excited to have you on. I know as a composer you've worked a lot with text scores, and that's like something that I've just like dipped my toes into. And so I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about, first of all, like what those are for the uninitiated, and how are they different from like staff notation, like you would normally be reading off, whatever that means, be reading off of?
Yeah. I think one thing that's always, because I waffle about text scores a lot. This is kind of my thing. One distinction that I always think is helpful is to think, I still haven't come up with quite the right word, but it's kind of a familiar distinction in text scores if you start to look at the kind of lineage of them, at least. There's prescriptive text scores, mm-hmm. Or there's more kind of figurative or prose-like text scores. And so there's some quite distinct kind of developments with both and ways of using both. Prescriptive ones would be something that just tell you what to do, mm-hmm. Have a particular event in mind, and in that situation text is just the way that someone has chosen to write it down. Mm-hmm. I tend to actually work more with the more figurative ones that are closer to the ways that we talk about graphic scores a lot, where it's something very abstract that we could do anything in response to, mm-hmm. Which brings up interesting questions of ownership of what a performance would then be, which we'll probably come on to. But
definitely, yeah.
It's always a very interesting discussion. But ownership in music actually is just a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, for sure.
But so I tend to work with the more figurative ones, and they are, just to describe what they are essentially, as they're just, as they present themselves, they're sometimes pieces of paper designed to elicit a musical response, mm-hmm. where a composer or whoever made the score has decided text is the way they want to write the piece down. Rather than staff notation. I tend to use a kind of a mixture. More recently I've been using, my music's all very simple, or sounding elements of what I do are very simple. Mm-hmm. And there's some simple staff stuff, and then a little poetic thing. I don't know if I'm a poet, but
no, sure. I think that's a really interesting way to notate music, and sometimes the specificity of staff notation is so limiting that I really appreciate the use of text as an equally valid musical element. I'm curious, how has your work in this sort of, maybe an extended or expanded medium, shaped your musical practice as a composer, as an artist?
Yeah. So for me, it's always just felt like the more logical way to write things down. Which is, it's a personal preference rather than something I think about notation broadly.
Okay.
But, I have a bit of a background as an improviser, and I didn't, as an instrumentalist, I'm not classically trained. I grew up as an electric guitarist playing in bands, cool. etc. And so much of the practice there, and the normalized practice, is that we in a band may write a song, but the song is a very loose thing, and mm-hmm. and we would, one night we might play it as an acoustic version that only has two of us playing and is 50 BPM slower. But we would call it the same thing, and it would be a response to this same idea of what a composition is in that mm-hmm. case. So that always felt much more familiar to me to work with. If I've written anything, it's quite a loose thing anyway. Mm-hmm. But as a practice of text notation, I came to it when I started improvising a lot, really.
Yeah.
And it started to become a way to negotiate improvisations and improvisers towards certain results that they will be able to find better themselves anyway. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of Cornelius Cardew did a lot of writing about that, where there's one piece in particular, The Tiger's Mind, that's kind of, it's this very nice prose text that is a description of the way this group improvises so that they might do something else with it.
Oh, cool.
But it's a very loving, familiar document of what they do.
I know one of the first times, I enjoy improvisation, but I don't enjoy performing improvisation because I have found it to be very stressful.
Yes.
And one of the only times I would say that I felt okay improvising on stage in front of people was actually during my junior composition recital, which I shared with my best friend. And the idea was he was going to be writing me a flute piece. And I'm a very good sight reader. It was not like we both had a lot going on that semester. And I said, yeah, get it to me before the concert and I'll knock it out of the park for you. And don't worry about it. And it was the night before and I went, you ever going to write me that piece? And he went, I haven't started it. And what we ended up doing was he basically gave me sort of a poetic writing out of what he was imagining that score to be. And it did stem from just extreme procrastination and like being overstressed. But what the result was, I went on stage with this piece of paper that was mostly blank and had to make it work because this is my best friend. His name is on this as a composition. Yeah. And I don't want to let him down. I want to present it as a good piece of music, even if it felt like we were doing something. It felt wrong. It felt very like, ooh, this is breaking the rules of music school. And then it was funny because at the reception, a bunch of people were like, oh my gosh, that was my favorite piece that you wrote. And he was like awkward about it. But for me, it made me feel very confident as an improviser. And also, it didn't feel like it was my piece. It was still 100% his, which was like, it was really cool, even though it was stressful at the time. I got up and I'm really happy with what I did. He was happy with what I did. And we both agreed that like, this is a great work of yours. And so it sort of fell into my lap that way.
No, it's a wonderful feeling as well, isn't it? Responding to. Oh my gosh, yeah. So my I suppose a more emotional statement, that my favorite thing about working in this way, I find it very personal. I'd hesitate to say more personal necessarily. It's partly because I've been working in this way for a few years now. Mm-hmm. I know where I can kind of locate how to put myself into these scores in a way that's more accessible. I did a lot of kind of thinking and writing like last year about I kind of think of myself as a score maker more than a composer now. Okay. Which I think is partly because these have moved a little away some of the things I've been making recently have moved a little away from. I think it was partly to have easier conversations with people that aren't experimental musicians. Sure. So someone who wants to know what I do would ask, what do you do? And I'd start to explain it and I go, this isn't very clear. So I make scores and there's some fun things to think about with like, even in like Choose a Piece by Bach, the score exists whether whatever happens, whatever people are paying to see when they go to see it or whatever people are looking forward to hearing. The score is a piece of paper. Yeah. And so you could put it on a wall or in a frame or in a filing cabinet or any of these places and it becomes a thing. Yeah. And it's a lot of fun to start playing with. That's my labor. The people playing my scores tend to make very slow, simple sounds. Sure. Because I'm quite a slow, simple person, perhaps. But it's quite fun to play with the idea of I think I try and write quite friendly music, friendly scores at least. And so the score is the thing I make. Cool. And then if someone plays it, a musical act that's engendered by reading it is the score is present in that, but it says so much more about like them meeting me and however much me's encoded in that and them meeting the situation of performance. And it's really, really, it becomes really fun. I get to play around a lot. Yeah, I think it's a very beautiful way to look at that collaborative process as well. Yeah, absolutely. I really like, I was talking about this in some of the research that I've done, where like, you kind of think of the composer
as like the author of music, but that's
Yeah.
not really what it is. Because an author, you write the words, and then the words they're the same every time. You put
Yes.
them in a book, and then the book doesn't change.
Oh, with props.
With props.
Perfect.
I was like,
Yeah.
I'm sitting on my bed, and I have my bedside table reading right here.
Great.
But the words don't change. And the author kind of at least has a majority of the time has a say in what's going to be present, even if interpretations by the reader are different. Whereas the composer is only in charge of the score. And if you're only in charge of the score, who knows how people are going to interpret it? So I think this is just kind of an extension of that idea that I find really, really interesting.
Exactly. And just on that author analogy, something I've been... the holes in this are all because I have no background in theatre whatsoever.
Sure.
But certainly quite a simple reading of the ways people interact with each other in theatre troupes and things like that is I quite like the idea that I'm more of a script writer.
Yeah.
Because someone writes a script on the understanding that a director and a playhouse and a production company and then every actor that's going to read any single word are going to meet that and bring their life to it, which is such a complex thing.
Yeah.
And that's the game. That's the idea. There are exceptions, like the Beckett estate is hugely strict on what you can do.
Yeah.
That's something that my sister, who is a theatre practitioner, said when I told this to her, very excited about it. But
yeah,
but,
I mean,
but,
there's
there's
also
something...
music that's very, very strict like that. Like total serialism is very much like you got to play it like this. There's not any.
Yeah.
It's not really any room for the performer to bring their own experience to a certain extent. But as much as it can be, I think that it all sort of exists on that spectrum of where is the creator of this, art. But like, who is the creator of this art is a bigger question for me, I guess.
Yeah.
So kind of to that end, in your experience, how does the notation that you use, however that looks in a given piece, influence the resulting music? Or is there really a connection? Or, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there must be.
Sure.
Just on, I think my least favorite thing any composer's ever said is Schoenberg said this thing about how his scores are perfect, and someone at best can realize them, can make them sound, but the score is perfect. This sounds like a really quite a stupid statement. If I could be so bold. But yeah, I mean they're present in the sound. Mm-hmm. I mean there was a thing I thought recently that there's a friend who I wrote this piece. This is called Kabat Abbas, who's this most wonderful cellist and she's based here in London, but she's lived in lots and lots of different places and made wonderful music in all of them. And she has this practice of she's doing a PhD around this at the moment. She's experimenting with this idea of just calling things a cello and seeing what happens if then that's her practice. So she's made this cello that is the shape of a cello, but its top is a drum skin, and it means you can't get it to pitch. You can get it to tension, but not to pitch, and so you never know. You can't predict any pitch, but you can predict intervals, or you can play it like a drum. Or she's had one made out of a bombshell recently that she can't lift, so it becomes a floor instrument, and does all the very large statements as to what can a cello be. But if you put anything in her hands, she's one of the most engaging performers I've ever seen. And she's my friend, so I want to write her a piece. This is kind of like your friend that wrote for you. Like I of course I have to write her something.
Right.
And I got trapped in this very composery space of like, oh, you're such a good improviser. I feel like all I could do is restrict you.
Yeah. Oh, I've definitely been in that space before.
But then I got to this thing, well, like actually, if it's just like personalities meeting, if that's certainly in collaborative composition, that's a very optimistic reading. It should sound like what would happen if I asked Kabat to do something. A lot of that's already engaged if I just gave her a blank piece of paper, because it's me giving it, but I ended up giving her this thing. It was 10 lines of very small print on an otherwise blank page that was just an inner monologue of why I didn't feel like I could or should write her a piece.
Oh, fun.
And in a slightly sleep deprived state, I thought, like, I've cracked it. I've broken notation so that someone can build it again and fix it. And 2 weeks later, she said, "I'm ready to record your piece." I was like, what?
Amazing.
And I haven't heard that yet. I don't know what it is. We're going to record it at some point. But
oh, that's so fun.
I think it's this. I have a lot of fun with pouring retrievable elements of myself in the score, and I've mostly recently been writing for friends who also already know me quite well. They meet it and they do something very interesting. And where I mentioned ownership earlier, I think the one difficulty there is, who is it more of, which I've kind of decided I'm just not interested in. If there was a very open piece that someone wanted to just play and call it an improvisation, but I'm not even acknowledged, that's chill.
Yeah.
That can be like, not to compare myself, but that can be like responding to an Agnes Martin painting on the wall.
Yeah.
And that's cool for me. But if it's helpful to say, I want to read and realize this piece and I want to call it a piece, then that's welcome as well, which is partly enabled because I just make the score. I've kind of decided that for myself. The score exists. Anything that happens to it is fun and exciting.
Yeah. I think that's a really fun way to view your own art. And so I have done a lot. Well, when I say a lot, I'm still very much in the middle of my master's degree. So how much research can I have done? But for my, my current phase of life, I've done a ton of research in the compositional voice and that kind of idea. And before we get into anything that I will go off on, because I've written a ton.
I'd love to hear it.
I just what are your feelings on the meaning or the idea of compositional voice? Just very open-ended. It's a very big question, but to start off.
I have some very positive things to think about it. I have some negative thoughts on how it tends to be used as a phrase.
Yeah.
It's kind of it's used so often with these implications of a meritocratic, individualized, you need to be different, you need to have your thing, and almost towards selling it.
Yeah.
Not that any of us are in this because we think we can sell anything.
Yeah. If you are, wow, that's
yeah, certainly
that's
no
a
one
choice.
I've met anyway. But so that's complicated, and I would, and everyone I work with would have a big problem with that as an idea. And it also misses out the idea that if someone just loves John Dowland, to choose someone. I love John Dowland, so there we go.
Oh, I also love John Dowland. Who doesn't love John Dowland?
Exactly.
Incredible.
And just wanted their whole practice to be making the music that John Dowland may have written but happened to not. That's where they want to locate everything. How wonderful.
Yeah.
And what and that's a situation where I would call that a very established compositional voice. That's someone who is completely in touch with their intention in interacting with a practice that the phrase would normally be used against. So I think compositional voice is a very nice term if we can use it right for people identifying with what they do, which is surely the goal, hopefully.
Yeah. That was one thing that I found really interesting was I originally wanted my paper to be something that was helping young composers to find their compositional voice. So, of course, as background research, I thought I should have an introduction of, well, what is a compositional voice? Which ended up being the whole paper because I interviewed 6 fairly high, prominent composers in the world, and they gave vastly different definitions. And then I surveyed other people to see, oh, well, which of these is the most popular? And they gave vastly different definitions. And one of the big things that I kind of stumbled upon that I thought was really interesting was in the survey, there was a question that was something along the lines of, can a composer truly realize their own compositional voice? Is it a collaboration between composer, possibly performer, and listener, or a collaboration between composer and outside party? Or is it entirely like something that the audience or the performer would pick up on, and then the composer has to realize it sort of almost third hand? And it was almost exactly evenly split in these, like, how is the composer's voice understood? And it was really interesting, because to me, I've always kind of conceptualized compositional voice as something that was a certain like element of personality that you kind of embed within your music, but I didn't really understand it beyond a very sort of nebulous idea of what that might look like. And trying to codify it in that way was just mind-boggling, and kind of shattered my idea of what is my purpose in music, and what is my role, and where am I going when I compose a piece. And yeah, so I definitely agree that there's a lot of complexity there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's also a link to this, like, you know, I guess it would be almost like a postmodernist idea, which I don't mean to imply that I've done enough reading about, but
I definitely have to do way more reading as well. I don't think anybody has read everything.
Yeah, but like this, you know, if I were this John Dowland impersonator, what would it be to do it 500 years after? Unrecognizable. It would be a completely different thing. And I people are complex enough that I think that's just as true of if I were to, you know, if I had a particular influence that taught me when I was X age or something. I think that's just as true. It's individualism is a really it gets weaponized a lot, I think.
Yeah.
There's a really good I'll mention it just to signpost it more than speak too much about it, because I can't remember it so clearly, but there's an arts group in the UK based in the UK, who've just as a collective been nominated for the Turner Prize. I don't know if you're aware of this, which I think is the first time a collective have been nominated.
Amazing.
Previously, I think individual members of a collective have been nominated for their own practice, which brings up its own problems, but they're called the Black Obsidian Sound System, and they've released a very good very like fascinating response to the idea of them being nominated for a prize that doesn't recognize collaborative work.
Wow. Yeah.
And a response just saying, what does it mean for us to be nominated for this prize that if we win actually holds very little value as soon as it's distributed by the members, and has a time frame that doesn't afford the way we work and things like that. There's so much artistic focus on I think quite a capitalized idea of
this idea of brand, and you have to have your image. It can be really very hurtful in artistic practice. That's not something that I've done a good amount of reading on or anything like that, but I've spent a significant amount of time thinking about it, and while stewing in my own thoughts, I've decided that I don't like that at all.
And we can see it everywhere, you know. It's in the way that we're taught, even by our very nice teachers.
Yes.
Is that's the goal, is to what's your thing, and then how is it different to their thing,
everybody else's thing. Yeah.
You know,
and this idea of one of the main conceptions of compositional voice I kind of unpacked in my first paper on it was this idea of absolute authenticity. And I initially thought that was a really attractive model of compositional voice, because you're like, yeah, this is me. But then when I was thinking about it, first of all, I didn't like the idea that like something had to sound authentic to be good or valuable, or because like it was something around 90% of composers found compositional voice to be of value, and further research that I've done would suggest that this is also really helpful in understanding your music personally, and as a major facet of identity construction as a whole person. So like I would say that it's fair to say that compositional voice has value. And then this idea that, it has to be perfectly authentic. And then when you think about it, composing music in a capitalist society,
Yeah.
it kind of destroys any meaning of authenticity, especially if you take, for example, like culturally significant music, and you might go on vacation and go to a performance of like real, authentic Balinese gamelan. And you're like, it's not. It can't be because you've commercialized it. And
yeah, because I'm paying to see it, and I'm a tourist, and I've
And I think the same can hold true for when we are making music, because we're not in the field to make money off of it, but we're in a field and told that we have to make money off of it. So you kind of get stuck, and that's I I have a lot of thoughts, and a lot of them are just floating around in the ether.
Well, and something I kind of realized on that recently. So I'm currently a volunteer in residence at a charity with a music program in South London, which I love very much, and that's always been a big part of what I do. And so it's volunteering I wanted to do, but it also comes with very cheap rent in London, which is not a cheap city, and so that's great. And I've realized that the big thrill of that is I get to make dull music that no one wants to buy. Because it's important to me,
right?
Because I suppose I would call it authentic to myself. Maybe one metric of that is that I know it's not going to sell, and I'm still making it. So, maybe, but authentic again is such a it's a marketing word, because what does it? The person is such a complex and changing thing,
right?
Even if it exists, what would it? I will be different tomorrow. Right.
And how would such a concept even transfer into sound? Like, you can't stuff a personality into sound.
Exactly.
What does that look like? What does that sound like? What does it mean? And I don't think that it's a productive thought exercise even.
I guess it comes down to authentic for who as well.
Yeah.
Whom? I don't know. Is it to be perceived as authentic or to be composed as authentic? They're both nebulous, but
I know that right now in my master's program, I am paying a very high rent to be in the New York City area, and one of the things in my program, which I do love very much, I don't want to be saying, oh, I don't like this way of teaching, but one of the things was, hey, you're in your master's degree and you've never written an orchestra piece, you need to be writing one of those right now.
Yeah.
And it's not that orchestral music doesn't interest me, but it's not easy to get performed, and I don't know a lot of people who just have orchestras sitting around waiting to play new music. Yeah. If you know of any of them, call me.
No, I know of lots of international competitions that want you to pay to apply.
Yeah. And I'm finishing up on this orchestra piece, and I think that it's fun. I think it's a piece of good music. I'm happy with it. But at the same time, I don't know that I would call it authentic. It sounds like me, but even just being told you have to write this because you're going to school, and it's about time that you've written an orchestra piece. Like that feels like it takes the authenticity out of it, which isn't. I wouldn't say it's a bad thing, and I should learn how to write orchestral music, probably, arguably, but it doesn't feel authentic.
I remain very scared of the orchestra.
I'm still very scared.
I think for me it's partly most of my music is about an instrument doing a specific thing slowly and letting that reveal things. And with a string quartet, that's a four-limbed instrument that works. The orchestra's got too many people.
Yeah.
I know my practice means I need to get to know them all, and I have the time. They don't have the time. So,
and one thing that I did lean back on when I was writing this orchestra piece was, like you were saying with rewriting Dowland, I entirely stole half of the motives I used from one Lotti piece from 1717. I was like, this is beautiful. I'm going to steal this. Thank you. And without it, I would have been way more afraid of the orchestra, because at least I knew what some of the tonality was going to sound like, and what some of the we're going to do a minor third, but then we're going to do a a tritone, whoa, and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
had sort of a basis to fall back on because I was in this area that didn't feel very authentic. So I picked something that I loved with my whole heart and then took pieces of that music and spewed it all over this one.
it's nice. Yeah, I think the closest I've got to a piece that could be for orchestra that my hand disappears.
It happens.
Piece, yeah, piece for orchestra that's kind of in the back here that could happen at one point. Also begins with theft. It's partly my way around that single instrument thing. There's a Ruud Langgaard's Second Symphony, second movement I really, really like, and it's kind of what I always want Mozart to be. It's like very sweet classical stuff from a semi-experimental guy from a while before.
Yeah.
The Cage. Anyway, and so the idea was to take just the phrase I love, and he's already orchestrated it for me, so we get past that, and then to systematically screw with the orchestration and then have it come back. But it'll happen at some point. But
yeah, that sounds amazing. I'd love to hear it.
So would I.
Hey.
If you know any orchestras,
I'll keep my eye out.
I think the thing on kind of authenticity and the I think a lot of that comes down to people like have quite a specific idea of what a composer is supposed to be, but that person should be individual, but that's a very preconceived notion before they meet the individual as well. I don't know, it's all very nebulous and mixed up with the idea of buying music, I think.
Yeah, I know, like, I was talking a little bit with my guest last week about the idea of composer as God, and I think that it's something that's kind of easy to fall into, and yet is very uncomfortable. I've never met a composer who, the first time that they had, like, their work read by anyone, be it, like, some, high school, middle school band, or, like, their friends, where they said, hey, read this, and you show up, and then you just feel this just soul-crushing guilt, cringe. I don't know exactly what it is, but it takes a lot to get used to that. And I think it is having this idea of, like, am I going to be in charge here? Is this me? Are you reading me? And it's really weird.
Yeah, it's really, really weird. It's very strange, and because it's such a disclosure in a way as well. It's so we should talk more on the power dynamic of that, because that's really interesting, and I think about that a lot as well. But also just that there's so much. I've actually found that quite helpful now that I've decided I make these things and I pour myself into them and I'm the thing and read the thing if you like. I've actually found that quite helpful because I feel like that's a very honest transaction. Transaction. I can't even use the word transaction.
Sure.
Which I don't think.
Interaction thing.
Interaction. Yeah. And it's not that there's anything fundamentally dishonest about anything else, but I think I would sometimes find in that quite awkward interaction that you describe as well, I would almost feel some. It's not a dishonesty, but it's like I don't know how much of me is on this paper.
Yeah.
And I have no idea how much of me you're going to retrieve from this paper.
Yeah.
But I know that I've spent 6 months on this string quartet, or however long.
The mortifying ordeal of being known.
Yeah, exactly.
You're just, here you go. Have
exactly. Which is not that there's a necessary discomfort with the idea of actually being known. It's being, like, almost found in a way for me. Whereas this, like, here's a piece of paper. It's full of text, and the text is me, like, 3 a.m. descending into whatever. That the worst is I wrote a post-it note at 3 a.m. once, thinking I'd, like, cracked it, and I've this is music's gonna know my name or something. I don't know. That kind of 3 a.m. thought, and I put this post-it note on the wall to come back to it in the morning. And then it just said piano equals mushroom in the morning. And I was like, what the... I don't know what this is.
That's incredible.
But so that, putting that kind of process on the page in a very apparent way, it's not that I think that's what music should be. But for me, that it was like, oh, I know exactly where I am in this interaction with performers now, because I've decided where it is. I guess it's
because piano equals mushroom. Absolutely.
Because piano equals mushroom, and that actually became a piece that didn't have any mushrooms in it. But it was
disappointing. More mushrooms in music.
It took a few weeks, but it's this piece, little text score about saying that pianos aren't actually heavy; they're just connected, and so they're difficult to lift because they've got like telephone wires running underground. And
oh wow!
So if you sit very quietly and hold your fingers to them, you can hear someone in Beijing playing, and you can hear someone in Adelaide.
Oh, very cool. Oh, that just gave me chills. That's so cool. That's such a amazing thought.
It would be, how lovely. It would be, and that's very, very much like, I'd been reading a lot of Anita Lockwood, and you know, and we should all do more of that. But
it's true. Yeah, I've definitely multiple pieces that I've written, especially throughout the pandemic, have been, I have woken up in the middle of the night, which I am a very heavy sleeper. I don't do that. Oh. I will wake up and I'll say, I know what I need to do. And either I'll like find a piece of staff paper, or I'll pretend like notebook paper is notation, which never ever works. And I try it every time. And I say, no, this doesn't work. Or I'll open up my notation software and I'll scribble something in, wake up and say, what on earth did I just do? And then I work with it. And I would say for me, during like the last year of my musical practice, which has changed significantly, I would say, because what hasn't changed significantly, it's been those kind of fever dream moments that make that feel to me the most authentic, or the most me. They feel like this is what I want my music to be. And that's really interesting. And then in the few performances that I've gotten, sometimes they're not that like I'll hear it and I'll be like, well, that's not me at all. It doesn't bug me that it's not me at all, but it's just a really interesting like relationship between my sense of authenticity and where I hear myself when it's performed by other people is wild.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's, I think, again, I suppose another thing to fold into that idea of like, I've decided that I'm in the score because that's where I feel most comfortable being. It's also kind of a comfort thing, or negotiating a discomfort thing as well, I suppose, is that I know where I was at the very least. For me, it shifts, you know, seeing someone perform after reading a score that I have written as a score maker becomes that there's no sense of like realizing my music in a way. It's
right.
Oh, how wonderful, someone's done this thing, and somewhere, however retrievable it is or isn't, somewhere my score's in that, and it just becomes it's easier to see it as a beautiful thing. It's always a beautiful thing. It's easier not to start to run away with myself as to like, did this appear, or was I clear enough about this or anything, you know?
Yeah.
It's nice.
That's really cool.
It helped me a lot, I think.
Yeah. Was it ever difficult kind of giving up a sense of control? I know I've done some pieces with, I haven't done many text scores, but especially like I've been getting into latency pieces, and giving up that rhythmic control was hard at first, but then now it feels very normal, and almost like the rigidity of our quantized rhythmic structure is weird to me at this point.
Yeah.
And how do you relate to control in your work?
It's very much linked, but I'll speak slightly separately about notation and then about sound making, I suppose. With notation, for me, it partly also came with this realization that like staff notation isn't very specific.
Yeah.
It interfaces very effectively as a code. It's a code that we learn that interfaces with years of sedimented embodied technique.
Yeah, I once had a 2 hour long debate with like 20 people over how long do you play a quarter note with no articulation on it.
Yeah, yeah,
There's no answer. We don't have.
exactly.
It's yeah.
Well,
Like you can
and
say
also,
it's a beat, but then what is a tenuto
yeah,
for? And yeah, you.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, and then even like dynamics are vague and they're designed to be vague
Incredibly, yeah.
because it will change depending on the concert environment. But even pitch, which is something Mira Benjamin, who's a tutor, I studied at Goldsmiths, and she was a very influential tutor for me. Wonderful violinist, and talks a lot about the malleability of notation in pitch.
Yeah.
Is if you have let's just say middle C. If it's unclear whether we're playing a transposing instrument, then it's a radically different pitch.
Yeah.
But even if it is, and I'm a guitarist and I know that that's a middle C and I know where that is, actually that's a transposing instrument, so it's a bad example. If I'm a violinist and I know what that is, it's a very different thing in the UK to in Germany to in the US. It'll be semitones different to itself.
Yeah.
It'll be a completely different thing if I'm playing a string instrument that has a continuous finding of pitch and I'm rising to it from a fourth below or descending to it from a third above. It'll be
or if it's the root of the chord versus the third versus the fifth versus the seventh versus the sharp nine.
Exactly. And so notation in itself is really not very specific at all, staff notation, but it is very effective at interfacing with things people know how to do. And so in that way, I don't think I have any more or less control working with text, because I'm just asking different questions. There are certain questions of a trained or untrained body and person in body that staff notation is the perfect way to ask. And there are others that are not. And so I work with text because it suits the music I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
Basically.
That's very,
it was a very long-winded
that's very cool.
way to say that.
No, and I think it also brings up a really good point too, where like for staff notation to be effective, it has to interface with some sort of training at least. And I think that has historically served the white rich male for a super long time of the kind of classical canon. It's only one very specific kind of person who could get the training to sort of unlock the way that we write this music.
Yeah.
So I think it definitely comes down to, making music in quote unquote non-traditional ways, because of course there are many ways of notating music that are not,
Absolutely.
Within this very, very narrow-minded canon.
Yeah.
When you're making that kind of music, it almost is, in many ways, it's a way of making music more accessible and more enjoyable for a wider variety of performers and audiences too. And I think that's really something that's very interesting. I never really thought of in as many words before.
Yeah. Well, I guess the other thing to mention, it's far from my specialty, but just to it's always like a very useful reminder, is that there's so often this distinction between like notated music and improvised music, but there's there's such a strong lineage of very carefully composed music that just is not interested in notation. Notation is not a helpful part of the situation.
Yeah.
It's an unwelcome negotiation, notation, in a way, that is no more or less malleable for that, is very considered. And then there's, I guess, to go back to the thing I was saying about bands, or we could think of the way jazz performers might interact with a lead sheet. There's there's a complete difference in an understanding of how flexible the piece is. Whatever.
Yeah.
Naming is very interesting in composition, like at what point we would name something the same as a repetition of itself. Like folk music of the British Isles, which I think about a lot, and is probably as a sound, a very strong influence and undercurrent in what I write. And family are Scottish and American. Actually, I'm dual citizen. Mum's side are from Iowa, and she moved here.
Yeah.
And that's from Edinburgh, but You know, that's a situation where it's very clear that actually there's another thing to say about that I'll come back to, but it's a situation where, you know, there's a song and it's named so that it can be better remembered, but the thing that is named is so malleable. It's principally the words often, and actually the melody can vary quite a lot as it gets passed around in oral tradition. And there's so much instance of, you know, the kind of composers we're talking about saying, I think this stuff's great, I'm going to catalog it so it's not lost forever. And, you know, Bartók is an obvious example. It did lots of very rigorous work that fundamentally changes what those songs are. In ways that have their problems. And but in the UK, Vaughan Williams is an example of, as I understand it, this might not be fully informed, but he went to do a similar thing and went off to lots of different remote areas of the British Isles to catalogue these folk songs. And lots of people funded that because it was seen as archival work. But he was principally interested as a composer to use material. So he didn't write down any of the words, but no one that was funding him realised that.
Right.
And then the people he was asking as the last known singers of these songs passed away. And so he's almost single-handedly responsible for the loss of we'll never know how many British folk songs.
Yeah.
Because he as a composer said, here's something I want to take
right.
from, but would still call it the same thing. It was titled in a way that would prioritise the words, but he was uninterested in the words, and it all changes. And it's...
And I mean, notation itself was arguably... staff notation itself was arguably invented as a memory aid. And that made it so much easier for a wide variety of people to get into this music, because you didn't have to be in a monastery and have, you know, tradition, like this oral tradition that you're feeding into. And then with recorded music, that had this other boom, and like, yeah,
exactly. And I mean,
it's all based on that guy's hand.
Hello. I guess a simple thing to say about like the notation of early chant and things. It was only ever used so that you could transmit that way of singing the music to someone you couldn't talk to.
Yeah.
But if it was someone in the town or in the monastery with you, it was a verbal communication.
Yeah.
As to what singing this would be. It's interesting, and there's lots of, you know, that notation is just now something that happens. It's something we have a history of interacting with, offers lots of exciting things. Unless we get stuck in this like Schoenberg, you know, the score is the work.
Right, right.
Which I think I'm in a way dangerously, like a horseshoe, dangerously close to. It's like he says the score is the work, and I say the score is my work.
Right.
And music is something else, I think. But
it's almost interesting to think about with like you were saying, if you could do it without notation in like when notation was, you know, very new, then you would do it. And like if they had, you know, the ability to just pick up a little thing out of their pocket, hit record, and then send it off to someone, would we even have a use for notation if we, you know, if the technology that we had around now was available? And like, that's a huge question, and it's a huge hypothetical, and I don't think we're going to have an answer to that. But it does raise a question as to, like, you know, why not say, this is how I want this to go, la-di-la-di-la, and then send it off, and then you'll kind of have an exact, more exact representation of what is in a composer's head, versus, I have written these notes on paper, have fun, figure it out.
Well, and I guess something that links with that is, it's like how dismissive an academic approach to music tuition is of DAWs, you know, and of that could be someone's. They are their own notation software and also their own music making software. You know, they are very visual depictions of how this music works and how it's constructed in ways that are arguably more detailed than staff notation. It's just not the same code, and so there's this danger of the code becoming a gospel in a way, I guess. And I mean, as well, it was a Twitter thing someone put up the other day, but realizing that most, I think it was Joanna Ward, who's a very exciting composer in London, saying that actually for a career in new music, it would have probably been more helpful to study graphic design than music. Something that's, yeah, something that's, I tend to start with an empty page and like do everything by hand. I use software for that. I do it in Inkscape, but even if I want to just write a quarter note, it's a circle with a stick. It's
right.
And then it becomes this very fun way of like playing with these materials as exciting things that can communicate in different ways. There's a good, I think it's Simon H. Fell wrote an article. Christopher Fox, I think it was one of the two, wrote this article that included a statement of how damaging. There's a wonderful thing about Sibelius becoming or similar softwares becoming available to people because access. We can only have more access. We always need more access, but you start with 6 bars and a clef and a time signature, and so much is restricted just by the paper containing those information. Even though you can delete it. Pieces of paper are great. I get very excited about scores. I'm a bit excited now. But,
no, I think this has been a really amazing chat, and I want to thank you so much for joining us here at Classical Schmassical. If you have anything that you want to promote, do feel free to do so.
Of my own
your work, of your whatever you'd like. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I put out an album, Piano Studies 1 to 6, which are all these love letters. Actually, they're probably interesting examples of everything we've been talking about as well. Because if you obey the instructions of one of the scores, it collapses on itself.
Very cool.
Because there's a bit you're supposed to cut out, and there's one where it's like a homework sheet, and
I love it.
they're on my Bandcamp. It's me playing the piano, and I'm not a pianist, so they're written to be able to be played by a 9-year-old or a professional and be just as approachable to either.
That's amazing.
Those which are on my Bandcamp. Also, just I wanted to signpost there's a really good talk with Joanna Ward, who I mentioned not very long ago, and also Lola De La Mata, who are both art practitioners and composers in the UK, where they're talking about a history of text scores, specifically through Anea Lockwood and Pauline Oliveros. That's really, really good. And they know more about that specific background than I do. So
wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And if you at home enjoyed the show, there's definitely plenty more where that came from. So make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you would like to continue the conversation on text scores, authenticity, the compositional voice, or notation in the modern world, please join the Discord, linked in the description, or feel free to visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/classical schmassical, schmassical, SCHMASSICAL. And remember, as always, stay classy and questionably classical.